Hello, a very warm welcome, everyone, to the Chair of Christian Thought 2022 Iwaasa Lecture, an evening with Pádraig Ó Tuama. My name is Carolyn Music. I am Chair of Christian Thought in the Department of Classics and Religion at the University of Calgary. And as we begin this evening, I gratefully acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wellesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Now, the role of the Chair of Christian Thought is to bring together the people of Calgary via three routes: the root of the University of Calgary, the root of civic institutions, and the root of Christian organizations within Calgary. All these establishments are committed to bettering the city and its people through raising awareness of social matters, as well as supporting the cultural and artistic enrichment of our local communities. Therefore, I would like to thank my co-hosts for organizing tonight's event, the Calgary Public Library, who have welcomed us to this beautiful space of learning and inclusivity, and the Wisdom Center, an Anglican institution dedicated to the nurturing of the spirit within the ethos of ecumenical Christianity. These partnerships have made tonight possible. The Chair of Christian Thought public lecture series occurs 4 times a year, and this series facilitates an understanding of the place of religion in the past and present regarding ethics, education, spirituality, and urban concerns. Tonight is the Iwaasa Lecture on Urban Theology. This annual memorial lecture is dedicated to Reverend Kazuo Iwaasa. Reverend Iwaasa served as Minister of Church and Society at the Knox and Central United Churches in downtown Calgary from 1973 until his death in 1982. Born in Alberta in 1918 to migrant parents from Hiroshima, Reverend Iwaasa was raised in rural Western Canada. He became a member of the United Church in 1948, and for the remainder of his life, he regarded his community as family and as a place to create tangible societal change. Human rights, social justice, and compassion were at the forefront of his ministry. He tirelessly contributed to welcome and drop-in centers. His concern and activism for environmental protection was before its time. Rabbi Louis Ginsburg, a friend of Reverend Iwaasa, said of him in 1984, "There are people who enrich by overt gifts. There are others who enrich by the mere being. Kind as he was to many and to many benevolent causes, his greatest gift to us was to bring into a world teeming with anxiety and apprehension and with the violence that may momentarily break out, a sense of quietness, a sense of those eternal values which endure amidst all flux and change, a sense of the dignity of the human spirit, even in the moment of stress and upheaval." Now, anyone familiar with the work of tonight's distinguished speaker will recognize notable similarities between him and Reverend Iwaasa, two people bestowed with great gifts. But before we move to tonight's lecture, I would like to call to the podium the co-host of this event, Don McLeod, Director of the Wisdom Center, who will say a few words.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thank you all for being with us tonight. We are absolutely delighted to be hosting this lecture both with Calgary Public Library and with the Chair of Christian Thought at the University of Calgary, and to welcome Pádraig to Calgary. I've had 24 hours with him almost, and I know we are all in for a wonderful evening tonight. If you don't get enough of Pádraig in an hour and a quarter or so, or whatever we have left, and you really want more, I have good news. We have a workshop with Pádraig tomorrow, so you can get 6 more hours of Irish brogue and wisdom through the art of poetry. So there are cards out, you might have seen them, colorful cards out in the back foyer there. And there's a QR code, because we're very contemporary at the Wisdom Center. And you can scan that, and it'll take you right to the registration page. And you can register right up until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and I'll watch for my email for you. Or just come to the door, Hillhurst United Church in Kensington, and show up, and we'll figure it out. And we'll be more than happy to have you join us tomorrow. This evening, after Pádraig's talk, we're going to open it up for some question and answers. Pádraig has a way of engaging us at all levels, and questions will just ooze out of you, and you'll want to ask them. So I'm going to invite you to prepare for that by reflecting on that, maybe jotting a few notes even. And we're going to run up and down the stairs with 2 microphones. We'll give you the microphone, the talking stick, for 30 seconds or so, and you can ask your question. So we'll have about 20 or 30 minutes for that, depending on how we go with time. But please do that. And then afterwards, Pádraig's going to hang around, and we're going to be up at the back, and he'll be at a table. And we brought books. Unfortunately, we got all the books we could get here. As you know, there's a lot of supply chain issues, and one of them is paper. And the books weren't even in the U.S. so far, but they were just released in Canada. So we managed to get 50 of them, but they almost are all gone. So don't stampede to the back. There are a few left. But if you want to have a quick chat with Pádraig after and get him to sign your book, Pádraig will be at the back table after that. Just a quick word about the Wisdom Center. Carolyn has already given you the polite definition of what the Wisdom Center is. I'll give you the more raw one. 15 years ago, St. Lawrence Anglican Church, an open-minded Anglican community that some people call a spunky Anglican community. It's hard to imagine Anglican and spunky in the same phrase, but it's true with this community. They love to ask questions, and when I was working with them as a facilitator, actually, we started saying, there should be a safe space to ask the deep questions about life, about religion, about the world, and about spirituality and where it is taking us. And so we threw out the idea of a wisdom center, and there is no center except in this network that we gather once or twice a year. And this is our 15th year of doing this now. And really, I think our passion is to reimagine religion for the 21st century. I almost feel like saying redeem religion for the 21st century. But it's our hope that we can move beyond dogma and return to wisdom, which is the source of all life, and in many ways like a great underground river that serves to undergird not just ancient religious traditions, but all of life, including the arts, of course. And what better portal to that wisdom than poetry itself, which brings us to tonight. I know you're going to enjoy Pádraig, and I'm going to invite Carolyn back up to introduce him more formally. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, John. Now, there are a number of ways to introduce Pádraig Ó Tuama. Poet, public theologian, and peace builder are just 3. Ó Tuama was the former leader of Corrymeela Community from 2014 to 2019, Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation community. He is the host of the podcast Poetry Unbound with On Being Studios. In addition to his latest book, Poetry Unbound, he is the author of several other books of poetry and prose, including Daily Prayer with the Corrymeela Community, In the Shelter, Sorry for Your Troubles, and readings from the Books of Exile. For Ó Tuama, religion, conflict, power, and poetry all circle around language. The former Deputy First Minister, Northern Ireland Assembly, the late Martin McGuinness, said of Ó Tuama's book, Sorry for Your Troubles, quote, Pádraig's latest work continues to challenge, provoke, and advocate that a better world is not just possible, but essential. Honesty, empathy, compassion are the hallmarks of this work, from a poet who accepts that he too has a responsibility to help make the world a fairer and better place. End quote. In short, the beauty of Ó Tuama's poetry brings healing. Pádraig Ó Tuama, please come to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. It is a lovely thing to be here. Thanks very much for coming along and taking some time out of your evening. I join my respect and acknowledgement to the First Nations and Métis, Indigenous custodians of the land, whose elders and forebears, past and present, we honour with justice and turning and reparation. I want to thank Carolyn and Don and Aoife as well, and the good people of the University of Calgary, the Central Library here, and the Wisdom Centre. Introductions are a bit awkward when people read out other quotes. When I told my mother that I'd gotten a book deal, she said, "Oh, that's nice. Did you hear the woman down the road died?" And I said I hadn't heard, and she said it was a very big funeral. There we are. That's my mother's job done. I trained in conflict resolution because the other things that I trained in, poetry and theology, bring in absolutely no money. And so I was thoroughly enjoying thinking about religion and thinking about poetry and learning poems off by heart. But I had no money to buy presents for friends. So I used to write poems for them for their birthdays, which I thought was a terribly cheap way to give a gift. And I realized that I had always been interested, once I became safe enough, and that's an important thing, I was always interested in what did it mean for people to have conversations with each other, especially conversations that felt important, and especially conversations where there had been a long history of what I now recognize as power and oppression, abuse of power and oppression. And what interested me in the possibility of conversation was what happens when a made thing occurs between people. And the made thing is language, where people hear themselves saying something and realize, I don't think I ever thought I could say that to you. I've said it about you plenty, but I didn't think I could say that to you. Or they hear themselves saying something and they go, I didn't realize that I felt that, or that I knew that even, or that that had been what was really going on. Those of you in here who write poetry or who keep a diary or who write in any form will know that often when you write, something happens in the space between what you've written and what comes back to you, where you go, I didn't know that I knew that, but it is telling me now, and something is created. That's what a poem is. A poem, poemia, the Greek word, means a made thing. And the made thing is the bit of ink on paper, yes, but it is also the experience, the event of the poem that occurs to enlighten you back. And you think you've made it, but possibly it has just made you back. And something unexpected is created in the space between that poem and its maker and the maker and the poem. And we're going to talk about that tonight in the form of the essential art of all of that. I should say I don't believe in the purpose of poetry. It doesn't have a purpose. Art doesn't have a purpose. I'm not a consumer of art. Art is not a commodity. Art is what happened when somebody spat ochre on their hand and slapped it on a wall of a cave. And they looked at it and thought, I just made that. And it looked back. I wonder if they came back in the next day to go, it's still there. Was it a marking of territory? Was it a keep the hell out of here? This is my cave? I don't know. Is there anybody else there? I don't know. I've no idea what that was, but it is the same impulse that drove me to write poems in code when I was a closeted, quiet, frightened, exorcised teenager, being put through hell for the idea that hell was in me. That's what the artistic impulse is. It is not a commodity, and it is not there for a purpose, even though it achieves things. The achievements of art do not exhaust the purpose of art, if indeed art even has a purpose. After 20 years working in conflict resolution, I mostly moved away from it. I don't take on any cases in conflict resolution anymore. I teach a lot about conflict resolution, but I don't take on any cases anymore. Partly because I went through a bit of a crisis myself, and the crisis was this, that I sometimes wonder whether a focus on conflict resolution is not a good enough focus. I really want to focus on creativity. What are we making? What is the made thing that we're trying to create in a poem, in a person, in a community, in a society, in a policy, in an organization, in a city? What is the made thing that we are trying to create? What is the art of living that's calling us forward? And I became disillusioned in a small way about my capacity to bring that about, and I wanted to focus more on the arts. We're going to start off with some poems from Ireland, and there's a couple that I've written that we're going to start off with to get the bad ones out of the way. Here's a quote from Frederick Douglass, the renowned emancipationist who visited Ireland in 1845. I'm not going to read the full quote, it's a long one. 1845, for those of you who know some Irish history, was the first year of what is mistakenly called the potato famine. We never call it the potato famine because it wasn't. There was food enough to feed everybody there. 60% of the corn and 70% of the beef of Britain was being grown in Ireland, which was known as Britain's kitchen garden during that time. The so-called Act of Union had been signed into place in 1801, making Ireland part of this latest version of what's called the United Kingdom. And Frederick Douglass, a man who, black American man who was a public spokesperson and writer about the criminal acts that enslavement are, and calling in writing and public advocacy for emancipation. He was paying a visit around various parts of Europe. And he said these words in, I think, O'Connell Street in Dublin in 1845. I'll read the first part. I can truly say I've spent some of the happiest moments of my life since landing in this country, he meant Ireland. I seem to have undergone a transformation. I live a new life. The warm and generous cooperation extended to me by the friends of my despised race. And he goes on and speaks about the deep sympathy, the spirit of freedom, and all of that contrasting with his bitter experience in the United States. And he looks with wonder and amazement on the transition of the experience. In 1845, my great-great-granddad, Liam O'Murrough, Bill Murphy, you'd put it in English, was about 5. And a couple of years later, his near Clonakilty in West Cork, if those of you who know Cork, in a poor family, a couple of years later in 1847, which was the worst year of the famine, the family decided that they would indeed finally go to the Protestant soup kitchen. And if you converted to Protestantism, you could get soup. And so they decided that they would go there. And unfortunately, he became separated from them. They probably died and were buried in a mass grave or in a ditch somewhere, his mother and father and brother. They were young people too, his parents, I'm guessing. And extraordinarily, the Protestant schoolmaster in Clonakilty, who spoke no Irish, and Liam O'Murrough, my great-great-granddad, spoke no English, took him in and kept him in the home, educated him till he was 12. Amazing. Years later, he confessed to somebody that he'd never made his confirmation as Catholic, and the priest arranged it. Quite beautiful. So here's a poem called, well, you'll see what it's called. It's called The Famine, and the word potatoes crossed out. Spuds means potatoes. I think you know that. But this is a villanelle for anybody who's interested in form. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. My mother likes her peace and her diet magazines. My great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. At the heart of that famine was the scheming of a state to bring a people to their knees for the state's convenience. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. On the phone, an Englishwoman says the Irish are fixated with our stories of the past in a way that's quite obscene. But my great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. My auntie moved to England and learned how to translate between the way a people act and the way their history's been. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. There are proteins in our fields from forgotten famine graves. Some families fed on rotten grass, and, my mother tells me, my granddad's granddad was the only one who made it. His family had all starved, so he missed his confirmation. Decades later, a priest arranged it. Didn't make a scene. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate, and my great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. So around the time that my great-great-granddad was 7 and falling apart, these words were still echoing in Irish ears from Frederick Douglass. And at the moment, in Cork and Galway and Belfast and Dublin, there's calls from some politicians to have a statue put up somewhere around Ireland or in various places around Ireland to Frederick Douglass, who I admire greatly. But I'm nervous about it. not because of Frederick Douglass, but because that previous quote that I mentioned, that I read a little bit of, is the one that will probably be emblazoned on the foot of this statue. And I think the subtext of that is, we're really, really good white people, those of us in Ireland who are white. I think that's the subtext of it. Because here's the Frederick Douglass who I want a statue put up to. In 1853, as you know, probably 1.5 million people left Ireland during that terrible, terrible time. On Gort the Moor, we call it the Great Hunger. Enormous amounts of whom came to North America, to all kinds of cities all across the place. Some of your ancestors possibly some of my ancestors, where nobody knew who they were and no records were kept. But this, in 1853, is what Frederick Douglass wrote in a letter to the editor of a newspaper. The Irish who at home readily sympathise with the oppressed everywhere are instantly taught when they step upon our soil to hate and despise the Negro. They are taught to believe that he eats the bread that belongs to them. Sir, the Irish American will find out his mistake one day. He will find that in assuming our avocation, he has also assumed our degradation. That's the Frederick Douglass I want a statue up to in Cork and Dublin and Belfast and Galway and anywhere else, because I'm not interested in art being used to excuse, and art and the life of somebody else being used as a way to say we passed the test without putting ourselves to a test. I think one of the functions of art, or one of the things art does, and one of the things that poetry does, is to irritate, to get under the skin, to disturb, to make you question, and to undo what it is you thought you learnt. And to do this in a way that makes you experience what the edge of shame can mean. I am not somebody who thinks that the idea of shame is always to be avoided, because I have plenty to be ashamed about in my person and in my country. There's plenty to pay attention to. I've got plenty of pride about my person and my country too. Shame and pride don't have to knock each other out. And it isn't a choice between one or the other. But I like art that can do that to me. I have another poem, which is this is a pantoum, a Malaysian form of repeating poetry. 16 lines with 8 lines that are repeated in different pairings. Phytophthora infestans is the name of the blight, the blight that caused that potato failure. Phytophthora infestans enters in through the underside of the leaf of a potato plant, goes down and rots the spud. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a blighted spud. It looks, if you can imagine what a rotten sponge would look like. Amazingly, it somehow is held together. If you touch it, you think this is almost all water, this is almost fluid. And after that, once it's been rotted, the leaves of the potato plant turn white. Phytophthora infestans. We love to blame the British for our past. A past that's blighted by a story we won't own. God knows it wasn't that our suffering was mild at home, but when we travelled, we shacked up with empire and occupied other places while crying about our home. Not with a rot of other people's making, but with a rot our own. And not because of how an empire shackled us, but because of something rotten in us. Certainly a rot of other people's making, not our own, starved us from our villages and homes. But because of something rotten in us, and not a blight that was exploited, we went and starved other peoples from their villages and homes. Our suffering was far from mild at home. Far from home, we uncovered something white inside us. But we love to blame the Brits for the stories we won't own. To be from a place that has for 400 years, and that's mild, some people would say 700 years, been a place where the question about what have the British done now is a daily political serious occurrence, does something to a mentality, does something to an imagination, and does something to the understanding of self-governance and language and power and culture and art. Everything, as lots of you know, is affected by the presence of an occupying power who bring with them their own language. And I think that there is something really important for us to pay attention to the pain that has occurred within the context of that. And in the midst of that, I want to say that in the midst of me being a fairly strong critic of empire and colonization, I also have to turn that lens of critique on myself and on Ireland, knowing that there are people who murdered, for the sake of an Ireland reunited after partition 100 years ago? And how do I pay attention to that? And what serious question do I want to ask about how it is we live in Ireland, whatever the jurisdictional arrangement? Desmond Egan is a great poet who's written this tiny little poem called The Northern Ireland Question. That was the phrase that you'd often hear on the news being coming from the British Parliament throughout the Troubles, 68 to 98. They'd say, we're going to talk about the Northern Ireland Question. And so he decided to write a little poem called The Northern Ireland Question. There's a reference to a game in this called Tig. I'm sure you played it when you were younger. 5 or 6 children, one of them's on, they chase after somebody, they touch them, then they're on, then they have to chase after them. Cots on, or there's all kinds of things you call that. The Northern Ireland Question. 2 wee girls were playing Tig near a car. How many counties would you say are worth their scattered fingers? Of course, the car is a bomb, and it explodes, and all that's left are their scattered fingers. And what he is doing, Desmond Egan, in this poem, is using what Eliot would have called the objective correlative, looking at scattered fingers and that horrific adjective, scattered, looking at that and thinking, let's view political arrangement and jurisdictional borders through the lens of those scattered fingers and ask the fundamental question about how is it we prioritize the question about who it is we are in a place that's shared, maybe resentfully, but needs to be shared in order that there are no more scattered fingers occurring. There's a brutality involved in poetry that addresses peace. Sometimes I hear that people think that peace in poetry, when you're trying to look at it, somehow needs to exhort people to avoidance. That you just think, well, just take a walk in the woods, you know. I like walks in the woods, but woods too are places of brutality and places of power and places where animals eat animals. Nature, as Annie Dillard reminds us, is not necessarily benevolent. It depends as to how big you are and who's around that's going to eat you. And the questions that are faced in conflict, ultimately for me, after the years of being involved in conflict resolution, boil down to, what do you want? Because that worries me, because what you want, you'll do. And often we find ways to say what it is we think we should say we want, but underneath it there is the psychic drive that says, here's what I want. I want to kill. I want revenge. I want rage to be manifest. I want to destroy. I want to create the chaos around me that I feel like is in me. Because what we want, we'll do. And it frightens me to pay attention to that. And it compels me to think we need a language that's good enough for us to pay attention to our own chaos. And I think that art can be one of those ways to do so. In any poem, I do think time is a character. There was a book years ago called "May the Lord in His Mercy Be Kind to Belfast." It's the final refrain of a particular poem. And my memory, and I'm sure my memory is inaccurate, is that I bought it and opened it up. And the first thing I read was somebody being quoted who said, everything was fine in Northern Ireland until the Catholics got angry and started to kill people. And I shut the damn book because I was unimpressed by an imagination of time that would think that you could look at what happened in the late 20th century and only begin in 1968. I want to begin in 1604. Not because I'm pedantic, but because any occupied people know that the past is not the past for everyone, and that it is the privilege of the powerful to say, oh, the past only began very recently, and the rest of that past is the forgotten past. If I'm ever to write a craft book of poetry, I want to write a craft book about time and how time seems to work within a poem. Gail McConnell is an Irish poet based in Belfast, whose father was murdered by the IRA in 1984. He was the assistant governor of the Maze prison, which is the place where the hunger strikers were, the H blocks, those of you who remember and followed along or might study that. And 1984 might seem like a long time ago, but it's not, of course it's not. And her parents were in their mid-30s then, and they were about to go on their 5th wedding anniversary on a holiday to the Balearics. Her mother had bought some holiday clothes for herself and her husband, some shorts and shirts, for going to somewhere warm down by Spain. And then a few weeks later, she went back to the shop to return the warm clothes. Was asked, do you want an exchange note? And time is a factor in a long poem that she wrote called that Gail McConnell, the daughter, she was three and a bit when her father was murdered. Time is a factor. And not only the factor in the measuring of going to Roselawn, the cemetery, to go to the grave, but in other areas too. We'll look at a section of this typeface. It's a long poem, and this is just a bit. Anyway, 6th of March, we drive to Roselawn, me and Mum. Trees arch the path before us and behind. 35, I do a quick subtraction when he died. The age I'll be this year. There's a fresh mound, parched and greyish, 3 graves down. They missed their 5-year anniversary by 3 days. I see her by the yew tree out the front. No cards, no gifts of wood, no coastal breeze and Balearic mood. Instead, she stood in line with shorts and shirts she'd bought for him, offering the receipt with mumbled apology. My husband's dead. I need to return these. Thanks, and no, yes, the refund, please. No departure, no getaway. The moment it starts to make sense, the moment sense slips away. Nothing left to say. Where nothing, maybe grace. Only this I know. My mother holding to her chest his clothes and that department store's fluorescent glow and every trace she noticing of him at home, while I played on my own or read or slept, and she sat up alone. One of the factors of time here is this line toward the front. At this top of this excerpt in brackets, I do a quick subtraction. 35, I do a quick subtraction when he died. So in any family that are affected by conflict, it isn't just that moment or the immediate aftermath. It is when you get to the age that that person was, and then the age that that person never was. That's how time stretches back and forth into all kinds of new dimensions. You know this yourself from your own griefs, and you know this from the levels of trauma that you attend to and the work that you pay attention to. And what we're looking for is language that's good enough, not language that's perfect. Language will never undo what's been done. But we're looking for language that's good enough, that does something where we are made and unmade and remade by it, and where you can return to it and think, look at that language coming back to me. That's what we hope for, or one of the things I think that we hope for. I'm curious about your emotions as I speak about these heavy subjects. I'm sure you go from sadness to remembering your own pain and anger too. And in narratives of peace, I think there is a requirement of the art that comes from it to have a capacity to be able to cope with brutality. And also, I think we need art that is capable of manifesting absolute rage within itself. Because rage and pain and fury and anger and explosion and violence and ranting are part of the human condition. And they are the place from which much art and erotic power and creativity can come when we're able to pay attention to them and harness them and listen to them and be informed by them rather than think that we need to put them away and deny them. They are, in a certain sense, their own volcano. Emily Dickinson has a great poem where in the middle of it she's describing, I think, herself, although nobody really knows, not even God. She says, she's talking about the soul, and she says, she dances like a bomb abroad. What a simile. Teach that in a school. Like a bomb. Listen to that, probably from the mid-1860s. Like a bomb. What's important for me in the role of peace is to be in a situation where I'm not frightened by the bombs that are part of our lives, the time bombs, the pain, the fury, the necessary anger that is part of the creativity that might be the very thing that makes and unmakes and shapes us. Lim Cisse is an extraordinary British poet, and here's a poem of his called Some Things I Like. It has a subtitle called, or an instruction really, called A Poem to Shout. I like wrecks. I like ex-junkies. I like flunks and ex-flunkies. I like the way the careerless career. I like flat beer. I like people who tell half stories and forget the rest. I like people who make doodles in important written tests. I like being late. I like fate. I like the way teeth grate. I like laceless shoes, cordless blues. I like the one-bar blues. I like buttonless coats and leaky boats. I like rubbish tips and bitten lips. I like yesterday's toast. I like cold tea. I like reality. I like ashtrays. I write and like crap plays. I like curtains that don't quite shut. I like bread knives that don't quite cut. I like rips and blue jeans. I like people who can't say what they mean. I like spiders with no legs, pencils with no lead, ants with no heads, worms that are half dead. I like holes. I like coffee cold. I like creases and neat folds. I like signs that just don't know where they're going. I like angry poems. I like the way you can't pin down the sea. See? I love the rage of this poem, the fury of it, the playfulness of it, the fact that the writer, the speaker of this poem, knows what it's like to be a wreck, knows what it's like to be abandoned, knows what it's like to be called somebody who is careerless, knows what it's like to not be able to have social graces, to only tell a half story and forget the rest, knows what it's like to not be able to lace up your shoes, knows so much about difficulty, leaky boats, buttonless coats, yesterday's toast. Why would you eat yesterday's toast? Because you've no food today. That's why you might eat yesterday's toast. That's why you might have cold coffee or tea. Curtains that don't quite shut. A home that is not necessarily kitted out in the way that everybody would want. Also, who is it here in this poem that's speaking to, say, spiders with no legs, ants with no heads? Who is doing that to those spiders and ants? When you look at a way that a younger person who had been failed by an entire system might be manifesting some of what they do by taking the legs off spiders, the ants off heads, there's no way here within which this is being called a good thing, but it is being said that Lem Sisi is saying, I like you, I see you, and I do not see that you are the problem. I look upon what it's like to be abandoned, and with fun and humour and generosity and wit and brilliance, he shapes a way within which this humble verb, like, can be conjugated for some kind of purpose of inclusion, some kind of way to say, there's a map that has your life on it, and it's okay. I like it. I know it. And he does know it. He was put into the social care system when he was a baby, and his mother sought to take him back, but was not given him back. He was not given his own name. He was given the name of his own social worker. And then he was adopted out and then unadopted, and then put through a variety of terrible systems of abuse in the care system in Britain. And then when he was 18, he was just unceremonially tossed out of the place into, I think he was given a freezing cold flat. I don't even know it had a mattress there for him to sleep on. And it was only after pursuing that he came across a piece of paper that had his mother's name on it and his name on it too, Lem. He's got a book called My Name Is Why, W-H-Y. Lem is Amharic. His mother's Ethiopian. Lem is Amharic for the word why. He is a huge public figure of brilliance in artistry in Britain. One year there was a very seemingly popular Christmas card because of its humour that was making jokes about orphans. And he led an entire campaign to say, that's not funny. They withdrew them all. And so he is an adored figure. And one of the things that I think he does is to say, I see you and I know your life, and your life doesn't shock me. I know it too. And it doesn't disgust me, and it isn't abandoned. I know it. In the context of conflict resolution, what you're often looking for is a situation where those people who have fundamentally felt unrespected and untrusted in society might begin to imagine what's it like to feel trusted and respected. And this, I think, is one of the things that he does through his art and his public work. And this, I think, is a way within which we're looking for language to do work that's good enough to imply the possibility about what might it be like to be trusted. I went through exorcisms and reparative therapies for getting rid of the gay in me. And I was 30 when a friend said to me, are you seeing anyone? And nobody in my life, nobody had ever asked me that question before. And the casual nature within which he asked it of me, I cried because nothing had prepared me for an easy yeah or no. Nothing had prepared me that I could ever live in a world where casual conversation like that could be easily done, and then we talk about the weather. Conflict is often, I think, looking for new stories, and not just conflict, the human condition. We are meaning-making, meaning-seeking, narratological creatures. We're constantly telling stories and reinventing stories, and you're asking somebody who you know, tell us that one again, even though you know it well. And you've got your favorite parts, and you're delighted when you get to it, and you hope that you can rediscover it. And maybe especially if there's somebody in the gang who hasn't heard the story before, and you want to watch them while they hear the best bit. Their shock, their awe, their sadness, their heartbreak, their delight, their humor. And the world is filled with stories, and those stories, I think, demand, because stories are always art, no matter what their source, they demand to be broken and remade. And I want to look at a story from the 23rd Psalm in the Hebrew Bible. This is a terrible translation. It's not even a translation. It's from the Good News Bible, which is very popular amongst children, with those children who read the Bible, I should say. Particularly in evangelical culture in Britain, and I suppose the small evangelical culture in Ireland too. So this is that you might recognize it from that beautiful prayer in Hebrew, the 23rd Psalm. You prepare a banquet for me, it's speaking to God, where all my enemies can see me. You welcome me as an honored guest and fill my cup to the brim. I know that your goodness and love will be with me all my life, and your house will be my home as long as I live. Gail McConnell, the poet who I mentioned earlier on, the typeface poet, she has a book that's come out recently called The Sun is Open, and it's a book-length poem engaging with what it's like to be her. And it's filled with a voice of her as a child. It's funny at parts. There's levity, there's ease, there's delight in language, all put alongside terrible things. And partly she does that to make something that you don't know how to hold, something that lifts itself up by its own buoyancy while also being weighed down by its own capacity to contain. I think she does it too because it is an art form. Anyway, in that book, she has the image of herself, maybe as a 7 or 8 year old at a church service where the children were being, they were in a Sunday school part. And the IRA had taken over the house across from her own house and observed her father's morning routine. And then on the final morning of his life, when he was getting into the car at the same time like he did every day to drive to work, they ran across and shot him dead. And I believe they shot at his wife as well, and missed her, and then went away in a getaway car. And in The Sun is Open, Gail McConnell's book, a child, a 7-year-old, is covering words from the 23rd Psalm. Enemies see me, know my house. We're constantly looking for the old stories to be broken and remade in order somehow, in the shattered fragments of it, to find a place where we can fit. And this, I think, is an invitation for us to re-examine and to break and remake, to unmake and be remade by the ways that we examine stories. You can call this a hermeneutical enterprise if you want. But to my mind, calling it a hermeneutical enterprise might put barbed wire around the necessity for this to be something that we all do, to look at the stories of origin that we have of our country, of our constitution, of our family, of our religion, and see the necessary ways where the way that we've told it is not sufficient anymore, and we need to break it, to remake it, to find ourselves in the fragments of that. There is no language that is perfectly sufficient, I don't think. Language will always fail. Ben Lerner has a great book called The Hatred of Poetry, and he says that all poems fail, that there is the moment that a poem arrives to a poet, and what they write down never quite gets that perfectly. And he rejoices in that and says that the question is to become a bit better at failing and to examine the nature of the failure of your work. I love that because, again, what he's saying is that art is never the final thing, that there's always the yearning, there's always the hope, there's always the desire that wants to go beyond the thing that we say we are making. I sometimes hear, when I was involved in Corrymeela, people who would use narratives from the Hebrew Bible, maybe the 23rd Psalm, to kind of invoke what could sometimes be seen as a bit of a Snow White imagination about what peace and coexistence look like. And this is a text from the early part of what's called the Book of Isaiah. Isaiah was really, and that book is really 3 books. Isaiah is a composite character writing during a time of exile. And this is beautiful in its poetry, but I'd like to pay attention to something that is in the subterranean element of this beautiful poem. A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him. With righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. The wolf shall live with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the kid. The calf and the lion and the fatling together. And a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze. Their young shall lie down together. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put its hand on the adder's den. They will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. On that day the root of Jesse shall stand as a signal to the peoples. The nations shall inquire of him, and his dwelling shall be glorious. So, at first reading, I do think that this poem is a mixture of a certain kind of violence in the opening part, and then what could be taken as naivete, to think that there would ever be a time in some kind of ideological magic garden where you'd put your child over a nest of snakes and go, look, it's lovely, we all love each other, it's all grand, work away, have a nice time. Give them names. We hear what can seem almost like naive hope in that way. On that day, the root of Jesse shall stand as a signal to the peoples. It can kind of bring the poetry of Helen Steiner Rice to mind. If any of you remember Helen Steiner Rice, I used to have a great drinking game with some friends where we would bring along a book of Helen Steiner Rice's, and her poetry would always be like, da 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 da. I'm writing this to you to say that I love you in every... See? You're doing it already. Here's the drinking game, where they're usually in 4-line stanzas, and what you do is you read out the first 3 lines, and the person around the table who can come up with the most suggestive and filthiest 4th line that rhymes and is in perfect iambic pentameter wins, and then everybody takes a drink. So... It's a lot of fun. I was out at a bar one night playing that game with some friends. The Helen Steiner Rice book I have has been used a lot, surprisingly. And one of the people who works in the bar came over and said, "What the hell are you doing? Like, you're having so much fun." And we were like, "We're playing with poetry and and eroticism." It wasn't even eroticism. It wasn't that elevated. It was just pure lust. It was hilarious. But I think to look at this as if it's naive is to miss some of the architecture of this poem, because this poem was written during a time of absolute desolation, a time when there was no hope. And so therefore somebody thought, well, I'm going to make it up. And that is one of the interesting things that art can do, is to say there isn't any hope, but I'm going to do something that nurtures the imagination. I'm going to pretend. I'm going to make believe and make something to believe in, even though there's nothing to believe in. Because this poem is saying, we know about destruction and judgment and arrogance and being struck down. And we know about the ineffectivity of language, being prey to more powerful predators. The poem is talking about what it's like to be displaced and poisoned and hunted, and sacred places being desecrated. And this poem is saying that it knows what it's like to be humiliated among your neighbours, and is seeking a world where there could be pride amongst your neighbours. What we're looking for is language that's good enough, even when there's no hope. And maybe there isn't any. And especially if there isn't any, let's make it up. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why there is an intuitive desire towards art, for us to make up the thing that might save us. That by making the thing that makes us back, something is created in the space between us. Something where there was nothing before. To struggle to know how to let language do its work, I think, is a task before any person. We're all in situations where you're looking for language and where you're searching for the right language. Regularly, I'm sure, with your friends, with your lovers, with yourself, with your family, with your work, with your political life, your public life, with your personal life, you might find yourself going, I'm just looking for the right word, or I'm looking for the right phrase, or looking for the right way to say this. And Jónína Curtin is a Métis Icelandic poet from here, and she has this extraordinary poem called Reconciliation, which I'd like to look at. How will I reconcile myself, the Icelander and the Métis, the settler and the indigenous, an ally to myself, since birth flung across a chasm? I often wonder, am I to forever be the way across? Weak anchors at each end, my spine a flexible deck, load-bearing, and within my cables too, much tension. As some try to cross, we all swing wildly in each other's steps. Without safety nets, the waves of emotion threaten us all. And then there are times that both sides seek to disown, to cut my cords, let me fall to the rushing waters below. Maybe one day I will just float away, see where the water takes me. But not today. Today I will rebuild. This time no quick fixes, no steel cables or wooden planks, no rust, no rot, no nails necessary, but rather the slow growth of twisted roots from ancient trees. The way across a path made of grandmother stones. I will become a self-sustaining structure, gain strength over time, a living root bridge that lasts 500 years. On a level of technicality, what this poem is doing is trying out two metaphors, trying out a bridge and then saying actually the engineering feat of a bridge is insufficient. And you can hear her hold this way within which the engineering feat of a bridge is failing in her own sense of self. Toward the end of the first column there, my spine a flexible deck, load-bearing, too much tension in the cables, and then the swing wildly, no safety nets. And you get to the stage where there's this question about, maybe I should just cut everything and fall to the rushing waters below. What's that? Give up? Just give in to destruction, move away, not look for a way to try to hold yourself together. Jónína Curtin spoke about trying to write this poem and doing research on bridges and then coming across living root bridges, which is across a chasm where there are trees, where the roots of those trees have become entangled. The oldest living root bridge, you can search for it online, is 500 years. Quite extraordinary to think about the possibility of something that is within and of and not of the earth. And what she's saying is that the way to reconcile herself, the Icelander and the Métis, settler and indigenous, the way to do that is to look to nature to provide a better metaphor. I love the audacity of starting off a poem with a flimsy metaphor and then allowing the poem to correct itself, but keeping the insufficient metaphor there to show that metaphor is not just a craft in a poem, but metaphor is a certain kind of technology that we have to know how to survive. And that by doing that, the hope is that we might continue to do like she does, to ask ourselves, what's a better metaphor? That one really, really doesn't work. I want a better one. Maybe Living Root Bridge isn't perfect either. Maybe there'll be another one as she continues to write. But I love the fact that she has a craft poem that in a certain sense shows its roots and shows its flimsiness, shows its rough work, shows its draft copies. We're coming to the end, and I suppose I just want to say again that I don't believe that art is for anything. Art just is. Art has occurred in every culture, poetry, singing, dance, all kinds of ways. Why have we done that? It's not just because it's a good idea or because it's entertaining or they were doing it so we want to do it too. Art is a certain container of the uncontainable because art looks back to us and art says, oh, there's more and there's more. She dances like a bomb abroad. Marie Howe has a line toward the end of her poem, The Meadow. I'm going to misquote it slightly, but it says, beloved, bedeviled, even now the words lie tangled on your tongue, and you must know that tangled among them and terribly new is the sentence that could change your life. That's a damn fine poem, even misquoted by me. But it's also a way of being alive. that there are things on our tongue that somehow only when you hear them being said where you think, who said that? You hear it back to yourself. That there is a creative, electric splitting of self where a you speaks for another you, and somehow you're made and remade, done and undone in that moment of artistic electricity that has occurred in the event of you and in the event of overhearing your own art speak itself into being, art that seems to know more than you think you know. In art, I think we need something that can hold our desire and destruction and pain and violence and delight and our remembrance and our control and our erotic lives and our lack of control, and something that holds the ache for survival. The Scottish poet Don Patterson said that a poem is a little machine for remembering itself. And I love that, because remembering is not just recounting what happened, but it is remembering. It is giving something in a way. You can be remembered into something you never were. And art does not have a singular purpose, but it does call us to look, I think. And I'm curious about what art sees in us. And I'm curious about what we see when we look at the art that looks back. And broadly, I consider the best of the religious traditions, and I don't mean the best of the writings of all the religious traditions, to be in the category of art, because somebody said those things. Jeremiah, who was the weeping prophet, in one of his prayers says to God, "You are to me a deceiving stream, and I curse the day when I was born." Stick that in a liturgy and see what happens. Extraordinary, amazing. Who wrote that? Did he know he felt like that when he was writing it down, or when Baruch, his secretary, was writing it down? What happens? How do we understand? Who are we in that way within which the unconscious speaks ourselves back to ourselves? Not for ideology, not for propaganda, not for control, not for spin, not for recruitment purposes, but for what on earth was that? Who am I if that can come from me? That is a moment of creativity that does hold within it creativity and chaos. And we're brought back, perhaps, I think, to an elemental fire that is within us that can burn or warm or both. And this, I think, is one of the things that calls to us in the art. The art you write and show nobody, the art you read, the art that's on the radio, wherever it is you get it. All of those are moments of that very same thing. It isn't controllable, and it is made in an act of unmaking, and we are made in an act of breaking. And that, I think, is the magnificent, electrifying energy that art has for us, and that can hold us together in a world that tries to break us apart. And it can break us apart in systems that try to just say, no, hold yourself together.
I have thanked more than a few speakers in my time, and I have this little formula or process, technology, if you will. I pick out a few key things that I resonate with, and I could hear mms or ah in the audience, and then I pull them together, and then I feed them back. And the technology is not working tonight. I can't find a framework to offer as a form of gratitude. I'm so happy that there were so many wonderful comments and questions, because those questions rain down as gratitude. I hear that, and I thank you for that. But I realized what happened was it's a poem, not just the poems, but it's a poem. It's a work of art, our gathering tonight. And you weaved that work of art with your gifts and your talents and with things you just realized when you spoke them tonight, too. And I love the way you weaved that. I love the way you invite us to ask the questions, the challenging questions, to challenge empire, and to push the question out to those that we are in opposition to, and to hold that tension. And yet always you came back to, and then I ask the question of myself. And in that moment, you remind us the two becomes three. The binary becomes the Trinity. And so it's like a marvelous poem you encountered tonight. I just want to go away and hear it over and over again and reflect on it and think about it and recite the lines, maybe memorize a few things, share it with my friends in the pub when Helen's Diner Rice runs out. But what you've given us tonight, I think more than anything, is a container for the uncontainable. And that's a marvelous gift. And the only way you can do that, and the only way you can offer what you do, and I know this now, I heard it in your writings, I hear it on the podcasts, but I really felt it in the last 24 hours since we've encountered one another. It's because you're willing to be honest. It's because you're willing to be vulnerable. It's because you're willing to offer your rage. And because you're willing to stand in the uncomfortable spot of being fully human and trying to name the things that are beyond naming. And to try to say that in the midst of conflict, there is still something for us. So I offer you my thanks, and I know there's a great echo of thanks and gratitude in this room. Thank you for being Pádraig. We have a little more time together. I forgot to say one thing in my introduction, that actually not only did we pack Pádraig's weekend with 5 different sessions, but another group in Calgary heard he was coming and got a hold of Pádraig and said, would you just do one more for us? So Sunday night, believe it or not, after all the things we're doing this weekend, Pádraig's coming back here, and there will be a group here at 7 o'clock. Our friends, the Round Table Initiative, have invited Pádraig to do a reading from his book, a reading from the Book of Exile. So if you want more at the end of the weekend to close it off, you can come back here at 7 o'clock. In the meantime, we've got a little bit more time, so hang around if you can outside or upstairs there in the gathering area, and connect with one another, have a conversation, maybe 3 of you, and then come and see Pádraig, have a chat, and get your book signed. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.